Minimize the flexing. They have a structural collar bolted to the oil pan and transmission. This is the engine principles test 8 on 2.7, 3.2, and 3.5 liter engines on the Chrysler side. You got to pay attention not to damage the collar, and use the tightening sequence and the service manual. You got a structural oil pan and windage tray that increases the stiffness of the engines, and the edge molded rubber gaskets form oil pan and other engine components. They got a metal backbone, provides superior sealing, precisely controlling gasket compression. Now you know what that is when you've got those gaskets that's got metal on the inside of them. How many of you guys ever put a pan gasket or something on and over torqued it when it was cork and it wound up leaking because you over torqued it? You know, you actually can cut the gasket where it won't do its job, and this prevents that. They're making it better.
Will over torque or when their valve cover gasket's leaking, they'll tighten it down more.
Yeah.
It'll help.
Yeah. And but anyway, there's a less of a gap between components, and the fasteners maintain their torque better. Now, Bobby this morning discovered on that Dodge he's working on that he actually used a torque wrench to go back and retighten and tighten the water pump bolts, and realized that he hadn't tightened them enough.
Let's tell the whole world too.
Well, the thing about it is, it was smart to use the torque wrench, and it was surprising whenever he put the torque wrench on there and he looked at the specs how far he needed to go to make it work right. You know, I mean, so what was it, 45 foot-pounds or something?
It was 45.
Yeah, whenever you pulled on it, they were actually all pretty loose. You know, you just go to they say, whoa, but you get a feel for that. These hose clamp that Madden put on that Taurus, you know, felt like it was tight enough, but it was leaking coolant too. I mean, the one that he did yesterday, put all that hose manifold. New gaskets, it minimize the need for sealant at mating surfaces. I do not like using gasket sealant if I can get out of it. You know, sometimes I use that assembly goo like the transmission people have to hold the gaskets in place, and I have used the Gorilla Snot, you know, the 3M weather strip adhesive. I don't like to use anything if I can help it. If I can put it together without that, that's what I'm going to do. Some people claim if you don't put gasket sealant on both sides, you're not doing it right. But I mean, the factory doesn't do that, you know, when they build it.
Sometimes you have to at the corners.
Yeah, sometimes if it needs to be held in place, that's one thing. But now the corners of the intake where you're talking about, even the factory will put a little dot of, at the corners of a V engine intake, they'll put a little silicone right there at the corners to make sure there's no seepage from that little tiny joint there. So that, you know, when they use it, I like to use it. When they don't, I don't. Back in the mid-'70s, GM was using silicone for valve cover gaskets, total silicone. They just put silicone on there and popped a valve cover on there. You know, that wasn't really a bad thing, you know.
Well, until you clean it off.
Yeah, it wasn't that bad, though. I mean, you know, silicone's not hard to clean off. Okay, you got a block and an oil pump housing in the front as the pan meets the block and the seal retainer. So there's just all this stuff here we're looking at. All the engines support the crankshaft with 4 main bearings. Remember that. Using bolts, 6 bolts for each main bearing cap. They're numbered from the front of the engine to the back. And they use thrust washers. Use loose thrust washers. What's that? What's thrust washers for? What is any thrust washer for? Anybody know? For end movement. Okay, what does the crankshaft try to do whenever you apply the throttle? The torque converter swells up and it pushes the crankshaft forward, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so whenever you mash the clutch on one with a manual transmission, you know, the release bearing goes forward and it pushes forward on the crankshaft, doesn't it? So those thrust bearings take that load, basically. You don't want the crankshaft walking front and back, so you're going to, the older ones, the loose thrust, who was it that built that one engine? Brian, I think you did. You took that engine apart and put it back together, and those little thrust washers that went with the main bearings were by themselves instead of actually being made on there, because you remember they were a little half moon shaped and they went on either side of the center of that crankshaft.
No, that was Quincy.
Oh, that was Quincy, okay.
What we did was like that too. They kept popping out.
Or something, but anyway, years ago, like on the Ford Tempos, they had a bearing that had flanges that were for thrust, but they only had it on the top. And before that, back in when I started building engines, they'd always have a thrust bearing with those flanges on the bottom, right in the middle usually, sometimes on the back. They'll have it, that thrust is important. Now this is really important stuff right here. There's numbers here, right? Which of the 5 main bearings is used on a particular main bearing? The number for the number 1 bearing is 2 on the block and 2 on the crankshaft counterweight. the main bearing grade's a standard size, which is represented by the number 3 in the service manual. So basically, you can't just slam the bearings in there. You got to pay attention to which one goes where. Keep that in mind if you're ever in a situation where you're putting a crankshaft kit in one of these engines, and read the documentation. A lot of times, people, whenever they think they know how something goes together, if you don't read the documentation, you get in trouble. Case in point, the cam bearings on this 4-liter engine that goes in the Jeep Cherokee is actually, the cam bearings are all different sizes, and on some of your Chevrolets they're like that. If they're not the same size, you might lay them out there and think all these bearings are just alike, but they're not. They're different sizes from front to rear, and they'll be marked with sequential part numbers usually, or if you get them from the factory, from the dealership for those Jeeps, they're color coded. You got to pay attention to where they go. So just on some engines you don't have a problem with that. You just put them all, put bearings in there where it looks like they go. But on these right here, they're built a lot more with tighter tolerances on that. So determine which main bearings are used on a particular bearing journal. You need to become familiar with the main bearing select fit procedure, and that's what this is talking about here. On early production engines, you'd notice 6 letters on the block, and they were used to internally to indicate piston size, and they basically removed that later on. Okay, going on down here, when installing the rear main oil seal retainer, use special tool 8225. That may be a question on your test. Look at your test and make sure there's not a question that we're answering as we go, right? 2.7 liter engine piston connecting rod assemblies have features you need to be aware of. An F above the piston pin boss and an arrow on the top of the piston's got to be toward the front. What happens if you put pistons in backwards?
It rattles and makes a noise.
I had an engine one time that I built. I've been used to working on regular American engines for a while. My dad was a bug mechanic, he had a bug shop. And I built an engine for a guy that on a rail buggy he had. And when I put the pistons in there, I called myself pointing them forward. Which is forward on the American engine is toward where the belts and the balancer is, right?
Yep.
Well, on a Volkswagen bug engine, forward is toward the dadgum flywheel. And so I put the pistons in backwards. And I didn't know what was going on because the engine was knocking, sounded like something was wrong with it. But the caveat was the thing would just absolutely scream. It would jerk the front wheels off that ground when you took off on that buggy like you couldn't believe. So I called my dad on the phone. He was way over in Alabama, and I was in Texas. And I said, what's up with this? Why is it knocking? Because I know I put it together right. And he goes, which way did you point the arrows on top of the pistons? I said, well, I pointed them, oh, goodness, I was supposed to point them toward the flywheel. And he said, you put them in there backwards. He said, it'll outrun one that's put together right, but if you can listen to that knocking until it comes apart. And it would. But after we did put it back together right, it was quiet, but it wouldn't jerk the wheels off the ground anymore. That's an interesting little thing. But anyway, they're weighted. They're a little offset, and they got weights in them, and that's one of the reasons they knock, from what I understand. The oil squirt hole on the connecting rod's got to face the major thrust side of the block. And you got to pay attention to all that. All of this stuff you got to pay really close attention to. It rotates. Which direction do this one operate? Rotate. Which direction do most engines rotate?
Clockwise.
If you're which way are you looking?
Looking at the front of the vehicle, or the engine.
It's going. If you're looking at the front of the engine, it's turning clockwise. If you're sitting in the car, it's turning counterclockwise. That's on these. Now on the Mitsubishi stuff, it's got the engines in there backwards, and on your little Honda Civics and stuff, the engine turns the opposite direction because it's in there the other way. Most people don't think about that, but it turns the way the car is going to go if it's in there sideways. You understand what I'm saying? It's actually it's rolling the same direction as the wheels when you're going straight down the road. Got it? All right. Now then, you got piston orientation markings. You got to know the correct squirt hole orientation, be able to determine whether the piston is correctly assembled to the connecting rod on the 2.7, 3.2, and 3.5s. Shouldn't be much of a concern because the piston and connecting rod is replaced as an assembly. So if you're putting them, if you're actually pressing the rods off and on the pistons, you got to pay attention. You got to notice a corrected. You know what a fractured connecting rod is? Anybody ever heard of that?
One that's got a crack in it.
They actually, no, basically you're closer than you think. You make the rod all in one piece, right? All in one piece. You basically cast the rod, and they machine the big end, they machine the little end. But on these, they scribe a deep scribe across where it's going to come apart, and they break it. And then when you put it back together, if you ever notice how when you break the handle off of a coffee cup, when you put it back on there, it's a perfect fit? I
Yep.
mean, you know what I'm saying? Well, if you put those back together, they're an absolute perfect fit that way, and then you got bolts going through that, holding them together. So it's better than the ones that are just smooth. And on your Power Stroke diesels and stuff, they're cracked that way. They've been back in the 7.3 days, you know, and all that. Okay, so now the front of the 2-liter engine has got a number of unique features you got to be aware of. You might recall the tensioner's got one position to use when installing a new belt, and another when you're installing a belt that's been on the vehicle for 500 miles. The new belt position has to allow for belt stretch, and the used belt position does not. So you keep in mind you'll need to remove the tensioner to change positions. Did you know that?
Nope.
If you're putting a new belt on there, you got to put the tensioner in a different position than you do for the old belt. I mean, there's all kinds of little nuances here that most people don't pay any attention to. To service some of the front end components, you'll need to remove a crankshaft damper using that special tool. Like we've used that. You know, see the special tool. This thing, does it have a keyway?
I'm gonna think it does not.
No, it does not, and it also does not have a timing mark on it.
Oh crap.
You know what I mean? So you just kind of push it on there. That's those things. All these Chryslers are like that, and that thing is really hard to get off there. But it doesn't. You know, it doesn't. It's not going to move once it gets on there. But we've actually, on the really early ones, we had to drill holes and tap them to pull them off. But then the balancer that we were replacing it with would have some little hooks for the you know, the puller and all that. So let's jump in there. Timing cover uses one of the edge molded rubber gaskets. That's really something that we need to, gonna have to use a bead of Mobar silicone rubber to see to seal it. See on the joint, that's what you were talking about, where the timing cover gasket and the oil pan gasket meets, that little L joint right there, you gotta put some silicone in there, you'll have seepage there. The water pump mounts directly to the cylinder blocks driven by the back side of the primary timing chain. Isn't that kind of annoying? The timing chain drives the water pump. When a water pump leaks, see, it's up inside that cover where the oil is, so you know where the weep hole is. The weep hole is through the block, and it's down there by the thermostat. Where's the thermostat on this one? It's basically on the side of the engine block, right there by the thermostat housing. And when that thing gets stopped up, there's another weep hole that goes into the valley, and it can make you think you got freeze plugs leaking or something. Bobby, if you see a bunch of water on one of the, like if you're working on one of these 2.7s, you know that, and you see a bunch of water draining out, looks like it's coming out of the transmission area, you know, from between the engine and the transmission, sort of. That plastic housing that's got the bleeder valve on it, and the hose is hooked to up there on the other end of the engine, it loves to leak. They love to leak so much they got them in stock at all the parts houses for about $50. Comes with a coolant sensor on it. However, there's also a hole down in that valley where if the water pump leaks and the weep hole by the thermostat is behind the air compressor is stopped up, it'll let water go out the top and go down through that valley and just run out all over the place. So it could be the plastic housing that's got the bleeder on it that the hose is hooked to, or it could be, if that one's not leaking, it could be the water pump leaking and dirt daubers have stopped up the hole on the bottom. They don't want the water pump leaking water into the oil. So they're going to run that water somewhere else when it leaks past that seal. You know the weep hole on a water pump, how it likes to leak on the ground? You know what I'm talking about. All right. So right here you got, and we're talking timing chain stuff here. You're working on a 3.7, but this is going to be vaguely similar to what you're working on, except you don't have a jack shaft like that, really. Well, this one here is slightly different. One of the special features is the use of chains to turn the intake and exhaust cams. The front side of the primary chain turns the intake cams, and the chain is lubricated by oil that spills out of the pump. 3 fixed guides keep the primary chain in place. You got 3 fixed guides, Bobby?
Yes.
There's also one pivoting tensioner arm that's held against the chain by a primary tensioner, and the primary tensioner uses engine oil pressure to maintain pressure, which is what that one does. There's also an internal ratcheting device to limit chain slack at startup before oil pressure develops.
Really?
Wow, look at that. Think about that. The ratcheting device?
Mm-hmm.
Were you supposed to ratchet that out, you think, and take up the slack?
No.
You sure?
Yeah.
It's got one of these.
I know, but it didn't say anything about it.
Well, maybe we have an issue.
Maybe.
All right then. A wear indicator groove on the tensioner is normally hidden. Now the tensioner's got that wear indicator groove on it. Pay attention to that. That's important. When you check to see if the groove is visible, make sure you rotate the crankshaft to provide the tensioner side of the chain with slack that allows the tensioner to extend fully. You know, that's a slightly different tensioner. It's actually going through there, that one, on the other one. All right, I'm just kind of whipping through here. We're not going to read every word. Now, we got an engine over on in the other shop that's set up like this. It's one of these, that 2.7. See how the timing chains are set up with the little chain driving the other camshaft and all? Works pretty smooth. See, you got some marks on there. There's a pretty good little handout on these engine timing marks on the 2.7. Allow you to check crankshaft to camshaft timing without damaging the engine. When the crankshaft sprocket timing marks align with the mark on the oil pump housing, rotate the number one pistons at 60 degrees after top dead center, and the pistons are positioned so the valves can't contact them. A lot of times they're going to want you to turn this thing so that the valves are down. I mean, the pistons are down, so that whenever you're turning the camshafts and all, you don't have valves going and trying to contact pistons and all.
The pistons are all halfway.
Yeah, or down away from the top of them. And there is a point where you can make that happen, you know. And that's what this mark right here is for. See, if you pay close attention to it and you understand what you're doing, it's really not as complicated. You can use it to verify the timing. You're going to place the number one cylinder top dead center on the exhaust stroke. Did you catch that? You're putting it on the exhaust stroke, not the intake stroke. You understand? The timing marks on the intake cam secondary timing chain sprocket should be 90 degrees from the cylinder head cover sealant surface.
Mm-hmm.
See that?
Sure.
Right there. You see that picture on the bottom right?
Yeah.
Pay attention. All right. And then after you inspect the primary timing chain drive component, see that mark right there on that one. Position the chain on the left primary sprocket so the camshaft timing marks between the two pleated links and lower the chain sprocket. That's the kind of stuff you're going to be seeing on a lot of these engines. Bobby's already been there.
Yep.
Now, why was it, Bobby, that we didn't need to worry about lining the anything up on the gears that were on the jack shaft?
Because everything was done by the crankshaft.
Yeah, you got the crankshaft, you got the big gear on your jack shaft. Doesn't matter about the marks on the little gears behind the jack shaft.
Well, then they shouldn't have had a special key on them.
Yeah, isn't that something? Well, I mean, Dodge didn't make that one. If you put the components correctly, the slack in the chain should be on the tensioner side. Okay, you got to have the slack in the chain on the tensioner side.
Mm-hmm.
What happens if you don't?
It's gonna move.
Pulls it out of time, doesn't it? That's how you do that. After you put the tensioner back in at the housing, you got to reset the tensioner by positioning it into the deeper side of the special tool, and so on and so forth. You got to line the right camshaft sprocket. Anyway, this is some really heavy duty stuff right here, you know. And what we're going to do, this handout is available, you know, and a copy of it if you think you need one. So I'm just going to go through this pretty good here and look at. Let's see, each cam's got 5 bearing caps marked to identify their location. You can take an exhaust cam, secondary chain, or removed as a unit. Make sure to see the service manager for proper removal installation. And you've seen a upper intake manifold like that one?
No.
I've got one. The 2.7's got that.
And so does the Dodge.
Yeah, there's a 3.2 and 3.5. Now look at that. 3.2 and 3.5's got a timing belt. See that? That's pretty. That's a belt on the bottom right. Yep. See it? Looks pretty good. The oil out. An outlet line from the block and back into the oil pan, route all through oil cooler. And then right here, if you remove the bearing tensioner, you seen a bearing tensioner like that? Time belt tensioner like that. Right there behind you is one. Grab me that one. That one right there. Right there. That's it. That's it. No. That's it. Right there. All right, let me see that. These kind right here, you have to push them in with a vise. There is no wall pressure driving this one, but it's sort of like an elaborate example of your hood spring. You know what I mean? It's supposed to have hydraulic pressure that's trapped in it that goes through. And whenever you push this, if you got a good one, you shouldn't be able to push that in with your thumb. If you got a good one, it is very, very hard to move it, and you got to put it in a vise, and you got to squeeze it in, and there's a hole right here, and there's a hole here, and you're going to put a really stiff drill bit or piece of wire through there, so that whenever you put it on there, when you bolt it up, then you can pull that out, and it's going to go out and hold your timing belt tight. You got me? So be used to it. This is a bad one that came off of a Honda Passport, and it was just going, it was rattling up in there, and it's very similar to this way it's designed. Okay. All right, there you go. When you're filling the cooling system, look at that, you got a bleeder. Pay attention to your bleeders. Anytime you're filling a cooling system, make darn sure you got a bleed valve. route the hose away from components. Put a hose on there so you don't get antifreeze on the belts. How many of you got antifreeze on a belt and found out that you had some issues because it was squeaking and carrying on? You don't like that, you know, and you're saying, well, this thing's got to go today and it's making noise and I'm not going to like it. You know, so basically you got to bleed it out. After you fill, excuse me, let's see, a pressure recovery bottle and clip the notch off the hose between the two chambers, whatever. You know, that's basically a refilling deal. And they got a little thing right there. Okay, now we're going to go, I'm going to temporarily, wherever my thing is, we'll temporarily shut that down. And we're going to go through the test. You got your test in front of you, right?
Yep.
Got your test in front of you. All right. Now then, let's see if we hit this thing hard enough where we can do this without a hitch. It'll take long to go through this. And let me get ready here. On the 2.7 engine, you need to apply sealant where?
Where's the oil pan and timing cover gasket meet?
Very good, Bobby. Number 2. On a 3.2 liter engine, the main bearing number on the block is a 3, and the letter on the crankshaft counterweight is a C. What is the bearing grade? Now that's something that we didn't cover in detail, but basically it's standard, yeah. Technician A says the 2.7 liter engine, the groove on the primary chain tensioner disappears when the chain is worn. Technician B says as the wear occurs, the tensioner extends and the groove becomes visible. Who's correct about that? Technician B. Remember the visible groove? There's a difference between the what on early and late build engines. Didn't cover that in detail either. The engine, 2.7 liter engine, secondary chain tensioners is the right answer to that one. At top dead center of the exhaust stroke, the intake cam secondary change timing mark should blank degrees from the cylinder head cover sealing surface and blank pins from the marks. That's something. How are you going to memorize that? That's C. That's 90 degrees and 12 pins. This stuff right here came from Chrysler. It's good stuff, you know, you're going to be working on these engines. You see how these things are kind of put together like a Swiss watch? You really need to know what you're doing, you know. Hey,
are y'all gonna be able to get it today?
well, we've got the radiator mostly in there. I thought he was working on it right now, but he's getting ready to flush the rust out of it because it's got enough rust in it to paint the parking lot. You haven't been maintaining that truck, have you?
I drive. Keep gassing, I'm good.
Okay, well, it may take a little longer to fix it though. We'll see. But I mean, we should be able to get done with it today. I thought he was working on it over there. He should be working on it right now. The guy that was working on it. But
Joe.
Huh?
Never mind.
Yeah. But anyway, when him and Joe are together, they typically socialize a lot. But he's almost done with it.
Oh,
If you look at it, you can see he's got the radiator in it. You know. So.
I
right.
just wanted to ask for my ride.
Yeah, we'll probably have to have head gaskets, a heater core, all the hoses and everything like that. It may run the bill up some, but it'll be all right. Okay. Yeah. Just go on. We'll let you know when it's ready.
Transmission too?
Yeah, that too. To arm the primary chain tensioner, what do?
You press the tensioner device and remove the locking pin.
Pry the tensioner arm toward the tensioner.
Well, that was going to be my next guess.
Yeah. Which of the following statements about the 2.7 liter engine rocker arms and lash adjusters is true? A, remove the rocker arms using special tools 8215 and 8216. B, you can replace the lash adjusters separately. C, store lash adjusters in an upright position. Or D, all of the above.
A.
That's D, all of the above. You remember you know what the lash adjusters are? Bobby. You know, when you take those lifters out, you can pull those little things out.
Uh-huh.
You know what I'm talking about? We had a 2.7 and a 2004 that came in here. Clickety, 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 click, making a noise on one of those. All you had to do was pull the valve cover off, figure out which one's mushy, and pop that rocker arm out, stick another lash adjuster in there, and you were done before you could say don't do it. I mean, it was real easy. And those are the same kind of lash adjusters that are on your Crown Victorias, that are on your 4-liter Fords. A lot of engines are set up with those hydraulic lash adjusters. You know, the center of it moves, but the rest of it doesn't. The camshaft has actually got that rocker arm with that roller on it going around. Okay, understanding that's really important too. Technician A says wait a minute. Yeah, Technician A says the 3.2 liter engine camshafts use 3 lobes per cylinder. Technician B says the 2.7 liter cams are interchangeable. Who's right about that?
No.
A, 3 lobes per cylinder. Which of the following features is found in 3.2 and 3.5 liter engines but not on 2.7 liter engines?
Freewheeling design.
What is it?
Freewheeling design.
Engine oil cooler.
Dadgummit.
Let's see, for coolant bleed valve on the 2.7 liter engine is located where?
Thermostat housing.
What about the water outlet connector?
That's,
Yes.
that is the same thing.
Yes, that's what I meant. All right. Okay. How's that? Everybody knows a little more than they did when they started out and you made 100 on your test. Is that good?